thanks everybody. Future of Web3. I think that's a really great topic. You know, we're kind of entering in this bear market. There's a lot of disruption going around. So just having an active discussion of why we're here, what is digital assets, as Raheem mentioned, and kind of like where we are going. It's a moment to reflect on where we are, like how we got here. So. I think largely it has been around speculation and what digital assets can be for the world. That's largely been the first few cycles that I've been through. And I think this last cycle we started seeing the first glimmers of product market fit. We actually had consumer activity executing businesses and people actually, wanting to display digital swag, and actually people putting in the pipelines to do financial liquidity and frictionless activity. So my talk here today is kind of where are we going next, and kind of how Solana fits in and how Solana can kind of accelerate it, as a very fast blockchain. It's kind of a pun. I guess a little bit about me. I'm the head of technology at Solana Foundation. And so you can kind of think of that as all the businesses and infrastructure on top of the chain itself, and orchestrating across distributed teams that contribute to the protocol, which I'll get into a little bit later. So first, I want to just give a very quick overview of why Solana even exists. There's all these other chains. There's a lot of noise. Like, why does this here and why is that? I have a very big temptation to get incredibly technical when I go through this, but these are kind of the first list of core technologies that made up Solana 1.0. And the key thing to note here, I'm not going to go through each of them, is that Solana was built up from a completely new code base. It didn't inherit Ethereum, and it was built from the ground up to be able to execute, consumer apps, commerce, DeFi, and a bunch of really, really important characteristics, even around things like not having a mempool, so there's not destructive levels of MEV, for example. So it's really meant to be this financial execution layer, competitive with NASDAQ, and but openly programmatic to be able to handle multiple business use cases. So proof of history is kind of the branded, unique thing, which is basically a way to have really, really smooth block producers, so you can have a really, really decentralized network, but still have this very efficient data generation. But then there's a bunch of stuff around parallel compute. How did the database of the active state of the ledger is managed, and things like that. I won't get into it too much. But on top of that, a lot of technologists got excited. They're like, wait, this thing can actually maybe scale to consumer adoption. I can actually execute a business on this. So we started fostering a community around that, or just it kind of started happening naturally. And we started this thing called a hacker house. And what these are is basically a bunch of people who are just inspired to start a business around the world could kind of get together and form and actually spend a consolidated amount of time forming those businesses. And out of that, over the last year, we've seen 64,000 participants, and from the companies, $1 billion in funding onto this Solana-based communities. Projects. DeFi itself, as I talked about, it was very much a healthy, NASDAQ capable chain, and so that's what you really saw Solana DeFi take off, and I will get into this a little bit later about some of my comments about the bear earlier. And then games. So you have this performance characteristics of a consumer app layer where there's businesses out there that I've been a part of that have had entire teams dedicated to reduce the initial website load time of 1.8 seconds to 1.6 seconds. And so I think games are very much fall into that category, and I think that Solana has been a big attractor of a lot of these games because they see that performance and they see that user activity and they say, oh, well, this is going to reduce my bounce rate, this is going to increase my user retention and all these things that really are required if you're going to execute your strategy in Web3. There's also NFTs on Solana. This is again where I think that we've really started to see product market fit. More and more of our lives are moving into digital, and we don't really have a good way of displaying this digital swag across platforms, and in a way that like one entity doesn't control. So like, you know, Google or Facebook or whatever individual app of the world doesn't control it. And we really started seeing this across the Ethereum and Solana ecosystems, where people were really excited about being a part of a brand, being a part of a community, and operating actual commerce where people were spending into it. Certainly some of it was speculatory, similar to the runs up to this, but also just as consumer activity. The other really interesting thing about like where Solana fits into this is that the network is always getting better. It is not a static thing largely as some of the other ecosystems have been. There's been some really rapid improvements on both the network performance and the types of assets and type of things that are represented on chain. Again, I won't go into it. And basically what this means is there's a really performant chain, there's a lot of consumer activity, and so if this right here is a chart of the on-chain transactions. So this is the green above, that is Solana's transactions. This is from applications, it's not like voting transactions or consensus-backed transactions. This is from applications versus all other public blockchains combined. And that's all other public blockchains are the red label. And so the idea here is this is like your first glimmer of like wide scale adoption of blockchain, people coming in every day and executing transactions permissionlessly and interacting with each other around the world at a scale that like blockchain really just hasn't seen before. Another really interesting thing is that has seen some growing pains over time. You know, reaching that level of scale requires every single time you 10x, you kind of like in a distributed system, in a scaling system, you kind of have to work through some things. You know, obviously you got an engineer up here. I'm going to show you some graphs. We did some major improvements probably around like in the spring, and you can see both the transaction volumes like rapidly increase because people are able to execute their strategies or to participate in commerce. We also saw things like transaction speeds go down, or sorry, full transaction time. Like I press my button, I expect to get that mint, and it comes back to my wallet. That's happening in under 2 seconds now. It's incredibly like Web 2 speeds because of a lot of the performance improvements. So this is kind of a graph of that. Like average under 3 seconds. This is actually even this is probably even like 5 or 6 months old now. We've got it down to like 1.8 seconds over the last 3 months. So really just kind of consumer adoption level, like Web 2 level speeds, but still at a decentralized network of over 2,000 nodes and that level of security. And the other thing that's kind of interesting about this whole like being ready to actually serve consumer apps is Solana isn't nearly at capacity. Again, I apologize for the graph and heavy talk here, but what this is showing you is that this is like percent of blocks that are full. Whereas like Ethereum and Bitcoin are basically always at capacity, and then there's like a fee market to consolidate which transactions get passed into another block. Solana is actually just constrained by user growth and user activity, and it's not constrained by the throughput. But every day I try to work to increase the throughput, preparing for apps, like all the great apps out there and all the great apps around the world to be able to execute their strategies and not be held back by like throughput. Okay. The other thing that's really we should be thinking about as an industry is, so we started off with financial assets, and then which are like really important base layer tokens and other things that are like really high value. And then the first consumer applications have been very high value, things like NFTs. To really flesh out that economy in that ecosystem, though, you really need to get to the point where normal just commerce can happen. As much as you want like the really high-end digital swag, you also just want like the more generic digital swag, or just like some more other representation that can be done much more efficiently. And so that's like another thing that's one of all this efficiency that I've been talking about, Solana also brings. So this is actually a real example of a business in Q2. Their app did something like 20 million transactions over those 3 or 4 months. And at the high end, or at the low end, you can say, oh, sub-cent, no consumer is going to care about that. 0.6 cents versus 1/100 of a cent, no consumer cares. But if you look at the high end, you can see, oh, this actually is a huge difference in the amount of value extracted from the network that my consumers would otherwise use to, spend it on my product, spend it on something else. So this is just like a pitch to really start thinking about adding value to your users and having least frictions as possible, while maintaining this security and having the best user experience, and driving value back to your ecosystem. And so that app was STEPN, and they made $122 million in profit in Q2. And again, that's because it's very, very good user experience, very low extractive. I think the other thing just to kind of point out here, there's a lot of text here, but the other thing to point out here is Solana's programmatic model makes it so they didn't even have to program their own on-chain code. They can treat on-chain code like an API. I have my configuration for my tokens, I have my configuration for my NFTs, and I can use on-chain DEX, exchanges and other things. So they only had 2 devs, and they got to this point. They got to concentrate on making a really good consumer app. Still figuring out, the industry is still figuring out sustainable tokenomic models, but a compelling app and not much engineering. This is one of the powers of Web3. I can execute my business. I automatically get distribution around the world. Anybody with the internet can interact with my application through blockchain. I don't have to worry about setting up a different payment rail every single place. Other people in all those places are doing it for me. Some of them are out there. Some of them are these great on-ramp, off-ramps are represented in this conference. So the kind of like where are we headed? I think there's like a reconsolidation of like, okay, what are the base principles in a bear? It's like, it's infra, it's new business cases, and it's like, honestly, like a lot of like public perception and things like that. I'm going to cover more of the infra layer here. Okay. So first is kind of like reliability. Like all these networks either can face certain types of congestion or just, transaction limits. And that can be hard as a business to understand, or as a consumer to know, okay, if the price is volatile, either from the transaction fee or just, or if it's just kind of volatile, block reorgs or other things that other networks are facing. But there's also the programmatic ability. This is what are the new business cases that are available to me as a business. I'm not going to go through each of one of these, but there's really interesting things that are happening in the Solana ecosystem. So one, like Token 2022, a lot of businesses are operating on either just driving value directly to their token price or by having an NFT royalty. Something that Token 22 does, which is a fungible token type, but you can actually just on any value transfer take a small basis point of this. And so one of the things that we're trying to foster as an ecosystem is instead of having all these Web2, you buy this directly and you give me 100% of that, and then that's just the end of the transaction. It's about facilitating economies where there is just you just take a little bit of value extraction, where anytime anybody does some thing out of like the joy of the application. But there's these really low friction that you just make sure that you, the purveyor, like the protocol or the consumer app, gets a cut of that so they can continue on the business. But then they cede all control over what actually gets done with those assets and like the actual ownership of that to the players. So you're actually just sharing an economy very similar to like a property works or stuff in the real world where like, yeah, maybe the sales tax here or there, or like the resale, you just take a little bit of cut there, but there's no 100% value extraction from the individual businesses. And that's a way more, lower friction environment than we currently see today with a lot of these, especially in the digital world. Yeah, performance and security. I actually think the thing to talk about security more than these exact topics is actually just kind of what happened with FTX. And so on the Solana ecosystem, there was some confusion around FTX being like the Binance Smart Chain to FTX, or sorry, Binance Smart Chain to Binance, as like there was Solana to FTX, which just wasn't true. But it is something that we as an industry need to be thinking about. How do we do the consumer protections around centralized exchanges? So I think there's really, really, really valuable conversations happening right now about both proof of reserves and proof of liabilities. And there's a lot of really interesting proving mechanisms that are operating there. And I think that we as an industry should hold accountable different exchanges the same way that we value transparency and authenticity of the actual chain itself. We should really be thinking about that into the security layer of our consumers and how we're helping them through that process, because that's going to really just like, that's going to get to the consumer adoption. All right, this is definitely next gen stuff, but we are doing, so like the formal verification is actually on the programmatic level, but it's reserves, it's liabilities, but this is actually on the programmatic level. And so basically this is just really, really, really hardening our systems, making it so there's less hacks, less, bridges are more secure across ecosystems, so we can really assure this cross-chain future. And scale to connected ecosystems the same way that our cities and countries are connected today. The other thing is around, I guess these are more around decentralization. So a Diet client is basically anybody can validate the network. You can do these like subsampling and things like that so anybody can be a participant. But anybody being a participant, you kind of need to be able to get to the most popular platforms in the world. So I actually have a Solana phone on me. So the mobile stack is a software layer. It is making sure that when I open my phone and I use my Face ID or my finger ID, that I am securely signing cryptographically. Solana mobile stack is about putting actual blockchain cryptography into that same secure layer element of the phone. So each individual app can't take any keys. There's no risk of that spilling over, but you can actually do really, really high event transactions and without having to worry about losing your keys and or any of, I can lose my phone and I have my ledger back at home that it has my keys stored, and I don't have to worry about that. But I also know that I can sign the transactions without applications. It's not software, it's hardware level encryption. All right, yeah, okay. The other really good thing to talk about in like the last little bit is the multiple block producers. So this is a censorship resistant thing. This is around geolocation across the world and having no single geolocation being the validator of the network at any given time. And this is something that's really important with a lot of like Coinbase and a lot of these exchanges being censored, being able to really think about an industry that we are distributing our networks and becoming very secure. All right, yeah, that's it. Thank you.